"You're a disgrace to our name," said her mother, until the Duke asked for her hand in front of them all. The words struck like a whip across bare skin, each syllable designed to flay what little dignity remained. Eleanor Hartwell stood in the center of her mother's drawing room, her hands trembling at her sides, while 20 pairs of eyes watched her humiliation unfold like a public execution. The tea service lay shattered at her feet, Meissen porcelain, irreplaceable, brought from her grandmother's dowry, and the amber liquid spread across the Persian carpet like spilled blood. But it wasn't the broken china that condemned her. It was the letter clutched in her mother's hand, the one Eleanor had hidden beneath her mattress, the one that spoke of anatomy books and university lectures and dreams that no proper lady should harbor. "You're a disgrace to our name," Lady Hartwell pronounced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, to every gossiping matron who would carry this story through London's ballrooms like plague. "No daughter of mine will speak of cadavers and medical science as though she were some common tradesman's son. You have shamed us beyond repair." Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. Eleanor's spine straightened despite the weight of shame pressing down upon her shoulders. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and now publicly ruined, not by scandal of the flesh, but by scandal of the mind. In the spring of 1823, such things were perhaps worse. A woman might recover from a whispered indiscretion with a gentleman. She could not recover from the revelation that she'd been attending anatomy lectures in disguise, that she'd touched the dead, that she'd dared to hunger for knowledge reserved for men. "Apologize," her mother commanded, and Eleanor saw the desperation beneath the fury. 3 daughters, all of them increasingly unmarriageable. Caroline, the eldest, too bold. Eleanor, too strange. And little Margaret, only 17, whose chances would be destroyed if Eleanor's disgrace spread further. Eleanor opened her mouth, but the words died unspoken, because at that moment, the drawing room doors opened with enough force to rattle the hinges. The Duke of Ashworth stood in the doorway. He was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to exist in Eleanor's world at all. He inhabited the rarefied sphere of court and consequence, a man whose bloodline traced back to the conqueror, whose wealth could purchase counties. He was 31 years old, unmarried by choice, and so far above the Hartwells' modest baronetcy that his presence in their drawing room was like finding a lion in a dovecote. "Your Grace," Lady Hartwell gasped, and Eleanor watched her mother's face transform from fury to obsequious delight in the space of a heartbeat. "We were not expecting, that is, we are honored." "I have come to speak with Miss Eleanor Hartwell," the Duke said, and his voice was cold iron wrapped in silk. His eyes, gray as winter seas, found Eleanor across the crowded room, alone. The silence that followed was so absolute that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the tick of the mantel clock counting off the seconds of her ruination being multiplied by fresh scandal. "Your Grace, I'm not certain that would be," Lady Hartwell began, but the Duke's gaze swung to her like the barrel of a loaded gun. "It was not a request, madam." The drawing room emptied as though had shouted fire. The gossiping matrons filed out with expressions of gleeful horror, already composing the letters they would write, the calls they would make. Lady Hartwell hesitated at the threshold, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, hope and terror warring for dominance. "Leave the door open," she whispered, a last desperate attempt of propriety. The Duke closed it with a decisive click. Eleanor remained frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by broken porcelain and spilled tea. She had never been alone with the Duke of Ashworth. She had scarcely been in his presence more than twice, once at a ball where she'd stood like a marble statue among the dancers, and once at a lecture on natural philosophy where she'd been disguised in her brother's clothes and had asked a question about circulatory systems that had made the lecturer stumble. He'd been the only person in that room who'd looked at the diagrams of the human heart as though he understood both its mechanics and its mysteries. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and moved toward her with the controlled grace of a predator. "I believe we have much to discuss." "I cannot imagine what we would have to discuss, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, though her voice emerged smaller than she'd intended, "unless you've come to witness my disgrace firsthand." Something flickered across his austere features, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "I came because I received a most interesting letter this morning from Dr. William Hammond. Do you know the name?" Eleanor's breath caught. Dr. Hammond was the physician who'd been allowing her to attend his private lectures, who'd seen past her disguise, and, instead of exposing her, had fed her hunger for knowledge with books and demonstrations. "I know it," she admitted, because lying seemed pointless now. "He wrote to inform me that his most promising student was about to be lost to the world of medicine due to the unfortunate circumstances of her sex and her family's conventional views." The Duke's gaze swept over the broken china, the damning letter still clutched in Lady Hartwell's hand where she dropped it on the settee. "He suggested that I might be in a position to help." "Why would you help me?" Eleanor's voice turned sharp with desperation and defense. "You don't know me. I am nothing to you, less than nothing. I am a baronet's strange daughter who has brought shame upon her family by wanting to understand how life works, how death works, how the body heals and fails. I am unmarriageable, unacceptable, and now, thanks to my mother's theatrical sense of timing, I am also publicly ruined." "Yes," the Duke agreed, and Eleanor felt the word like a slap. "You are all of those things, which makes you perfect." Perfect for what, exactly? He moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of sandalwood and something else, books, perhaps, or the particular mustiness of old libraries. "Perfect to be my wife." The world tilted. Eleanor's hand shot out to grip the back of a chair before her knees could betray her. "That's not amusing, Your Grace." "I rarely find humor in anything, Miss Hartwell. I am being entirely serious." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, and Eleanor recognized the heavy vellum of formal correspondence. "I need a wife. More specifically, I need a wife who will not expect me to love her, will not demand my time or attention, and will not interfere with my work. In exchange, I can offer you something you want even more desperately than you want respectability. I can offer you freedom." "Freedom," Eleanor repeated, and the word tasted like ash and honey mixed together. "I have a laboratory in my country estate," the Duke continued, his tone as businesslike as though he were discussing crop rotations. "I have a complete medical library, including several texts that are banned in England. I correspond with physicians across Europe. Dr. Hammond himself has agreed to continue your education if you have the proper social protection to do so." He paused, and for the first time, something almost human entered his voice. "I am offering you a marriage of convenience, Miss Hartwell. You will have my name, my protection, and my complete indifference. I will have a duchess who asks nothing of me and gives society no reason to demand I produce an heir immediately." Eleanor's mind raced through the implications, the impossibilities, the sheer audacity of what he was proposing. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you do this? What do you truly gain?" The Duke's expression shuddered, becoming as distant as mountains. "That, Miss Hartwell, is my concern alone. Do you accept? I don't even know you. And you never will if you prefer it that way." He extended his hand, and Eleanor saw that his fingers were stained with ink. "But you should know this. In 5 minutes, I intend to walk back into that corridor where your mother and half of London society are doubtless pressed against the door. I will ask for your hand in front of all of them. You may accept or refuse as you wish. But if you refuse, you will have nothing. Not even your disgrace will be entirely your own, because it will destroy your sisters as well." It was a trap dressed as salvation, and they both knew it. But Eleanor had spent her entire life in traps of one kind or another. The trap of being born female, the trap of being born curious, the trap of a world that feared women who wanted to understand it rather than merely inhabit it. "If I accept," she said slowly, "I want it in writing, the laboratory, the books, the freedom to study, all of it. Naturally, I am a man who honors his contracts, Miss Hartwell." He drew out a second paper, already prepared, already written in a lawyer's precise hand. Eleanor scanned it quickly and found everything he'd promised, laid out in legal language that would be binding. Her hand shook as she took the offered pen. Her signature looked childish next to his bold scrawl, but it was done. "Then I suppose we have an understanding, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he said quietly, "if you are to be my wife, you should at least know my given name." "Eleanor," she replied, though he already knew it. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "One more thing, Miss Hartwell. I do not sleep well. I keep strange hours. You will often find me in my laboratory in the middle of the night. I would appreciate it if you did not inquire about what I do there." "I would appreciate the same courtesy," Eleanor said. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face. "Then we are perfectly matched." He opened the door to find exactly what they'd both expected. Lady Hartwell practically falling through the doorway, a crowd of women pressed behind her like a Greek chorus waiting for tragedy. The Duke of Ashworth stepped into the corridor, and his voice carried with the authority of a man who'd never been refused anything. "Lady Hartwell, ladies, I have the honor of requesting Miss Eleanor Hartwell's hand in marriage. I hope she will consent to be my wife." Eleanor stepped forward, her head high despite the chaos of her appearance, the tea stains on her dress, the broken china still scattered behind her. She met her mother's eyes and saw the war there, disbelief, calculation, desperate hope. "I accept, Your Grace," Eleanor said clearly. "I would be honored to be your wife." The corridor erupted in gasps and fevered whispers. Lady Hartwell looked as though she might faint or transcend into pure light. Eleanor couldn't tell which. "Excellent," the Duke said, and took Eleanor's hand with a formality that bordered on coldness. "I will call upon you tomorrow to discuss the arrangements. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks." 3 weeks! Lady Hartwell's voice climbed toward hysteria. "But, Your Grace, that's barely enough time to—" "3 weeks," the Duke repeated, and the steel in his voice cut through every objection. "Good day, Lady Hartwell. Miss Hartwell." He bowed, released Eleanor's hand, and walked away, as though he'd just concluded a business transaction. Which, Eleanor supposed, he had. The moment he disappeared down the stairs, the corridor exploded into chaos. Questions flew at Eleanor like stones. How did this happen? When did you meet? Did he compromise you? Why would the Duke of Ashworth want you? That last question, whispered by Mrs. Catherine Thornbury with unconcealed venom, cut through the noise. "Why wouldn't he want me?" Eleanor asked, and watched the woman's face purple with rage. Her mother seized her arm and dragged her back into the drawing room, slamming the door on the gossips. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, mother and daughter, strangers bound by blood and circumstance. "How?" Lady Hartwell whispered. "How did you manage this?" "I didn't manage anything, Mother. He made me an offer, and I accepted it." "An offer? The Duke of Ashworth made you an offer?" Her mother's laugh was slightly unhinged. "Do you understand what you've done? You've saved us, all of us. Caroline can marry now. Her age won't matter if her sister is a duchess. And Margaret, oh, Margaret will have the season she deserves." Eleanor felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders. She'd traded herself for her sister's futures, but she'd also traded herself for something she wanted desperately, something worth the price. "Yes, Mother," she said quietly. Lady Hartwell's expression softened, becoming almost tender. "I never thought you'd marry well, Eleanor. You're too strange, too difficult. But you've managed to marry better than any of us dreamed." She paused, then added with surprising gentleness, "Try to make him happy, dear. Try not to shame him with your peculiar interests." Eleanor nodded, though she had no intention of keeping that implicit promise. The Duke had offered her freedom, and she intended to take it with both hands. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor pulled out her hidden anatomy texts and ran her fingers over the detailed drawings of muscles and organs and bones. In 3 weeks, she would be the Duchess of Ashworth. She would have access to knowledge that most women couldn't even imagine. She would be able to study and learn and understand. But she would also be bound to a man she didn't know, a man with secrets in his eyes and stains on his fingers, a man who kept strange hours and wanted a wife who would never ask questions. Eleanor pressed her hand against the window glass and looked out at the London night. Somewhere in this city, the Duke of Ashworth was doing the same, perhaps wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. They would find out together. The next 3 weeks passed in a fever dream of preparation. Lady Hartwell transformed into a creature of manic efficiency, determined to present her daughter as worthy of ducal attention. Modistes were summoned, trousseaux assembled, and every detail scrutinized until Eleanor felt less like a bride and more like a prize mare being prepared for auction. The Duke called exactly once, staying precisely 15 minutes. He brought the marriage contract, even more detailed than the initial agreement, and a velvet box containing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, an emerald surrounded by diamonds, heavy enough to feel like a shackle. "You don't have to wear it if you don't wish to," he said, watching Eleanor examine the jewel with something that might have been clinical interest. "But society will expect it." "Society expects many things," Eleanor replied, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which seemed impossible and slightly unnerving. "I'm learning to gauge which expectations." A valuable skill. He stood, preparing to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Your Grace, Sebastian, may I ask you something?" He turned, his expression wary. "You may ask, I may not answer." "Why do you really need a wife? A man of your position, your wealth, you could have anyone. You could wait years if you wished." Why this marriage? Why now? Why me? For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Desperation, perhaps, or fear so carefully controlled it appeared as ice. "Because I am running out of time," he said finally, "and you are the only woman I've met who might understand why that matters." He left before she could ask what he meant. The wedding took place on a gray morning in April, in the Duke's private chapel at his London residence. It was a small affair, despite Lady Hartwell's protests. Immediate family only, no elaborate breakfast, no public spectacle. Eleanor walked down the aisle in cream silk that made her skin look pale as parchment, and when she reached the altar, the Duke took her hand with fingers that were cold as death. They spoke their vows in voices that didn't waver. The bishop pronounced them man and wife. The Duke, her husband now, kissed her cheek with the warmth of a marble statue acknowledging a petitioner. "Shall we?" he murmured, offering his arm. They fled the chapel like thieves escaping a heist, leaving the family to celebrate without them. The Duke handed Eleanor into his carriage, and they set off immediately for Ashworth Castle, 3 hours north of London. Eleanor watched the city fall away and felt the weight of her new life settle over her like armor or chains. She couldn't yet tell which. "You must have questions," the Duke said, breaking the silence that had stretched for miles. "Hundreds," Eleanor admitted, "but you've made it clear that questions are not part of our arrangement." "Questions about my work are not part of our arrangement," he corrected. "You may ask anything else you wish." Eleanor turned to study his profile, sharp as cut glass, beautiful in the way that cold things are beautiful. "Do you regret this already?" No. He met her gaze, and Eleanor saw something there that surprised her. Honesty, stark and uncomfortable. "I regret the necessity of it." "I regret that we live in a world where a woman of your intelligence must bind herself to a stranger to pursue knowledge, but I do not regret the marriage itself." "That's unexpectedly philosophical." "I have my moments." A pause, then. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Ask me again in 6 months." "Fair enough." They lapsed back into silence, but it felt less oppressive now, more like the comfortable quiet of two people who'd agreed to coexist rather than the terrible silence of two people trapped together. Ashworth Castle emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, all gray stone and towering turrets, surrounded by forests that pressed close like dark water. It was beautiful in a forbidding way, and Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten and release simultaneously. "Welcome home, Duchess," the Duke said, and there might have been the faintest trace of warmth in his voice. The servants lined up to greet them, and Eleanor was introduced to what felt like 100 faces she'd never remember. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, was a stern woman with kind eyes who took Eleanor's hand and said, "We're glad to have a mistress here again, Your Grace. It's been too long." "How long?" Eleanor asked. 15 years, Mrs. Blackwood replied, "since the late Duchess passed." Eleanor glanced at the Duke and found his expression carefully blank. His mother, then? Dead for 15 years, and he'd never remarried until now. Another mystery to add to the growing collection. The Duke showed Eleanor to her chambers, a suite of rooms done in blue and gold, with windows that overlooked the forest. Her medical texts had already been unpacked and placed on shelves beside leather-bound volumes of poetry and history. "Your laboratory is in the east wing," he said, standing in the doorway as though afraid to enter her private space. "3rd floor. Dr. Hammond will arrive next week to begin your continued education. Until then, please make yourself comfortable. Explore the house. The library is extensive. I think you'll enjoy it." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "Where are your rooms?" "West wing. We are far enough apart for propriety and privacy." He paused, then added with what might have been a hint of dark humor, "Though, as we're married, propriety is no longer strictly required." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I understand the terms of our arrangement, Your Grace. You need not worry that I'll make demands on your time or person." "Sebastian," he said quietly, "please, if we're to live together, you should use my name." "Sebastian," Eleanor repeated, and watched something in his expression shift, soften, perhaps, or break. He left her then, closing the door with a soft click that sounded final. Eleanor stood alone in her new chambers, Duchess of Ashworth, married to a stranger, surrounded by luxury and opportunity, and a loneliness so profound it made her bones ache. She unpacked her anatomy texts and arranged them on the shelf with careful precision. This was what she'd wanted. This was what she'd chosen. The price had been paid, and now she would reap the rewards. But that night, lying in her massive canopied bed with silk sheets that smelled of lavender and isolation, Eleanor wondered if knowledge could ever truly compensate for connection, if freedom purchased with loneliness was freedom at all. Somewhere in the West Wing, she imagined the Duke was wondering the same thing. Eleanor woke to find a note slipped under her door, written in the Duke's distinctive hand. "The laboratory is unlocked. The library is at your disposal. I am occupied with estate business today and tomorrow. Please forgive my absence. S." She dressed quickly in one of her simple day dresses, much to her ladymaid's horror, and set off to explore her new domain. The castle was a labyrinth of corridors and staircases, galleries lined with portraits of austere ancestors, and rooms that seemed to exist for no purpose beyond displaying wealth. But Eleanor wasn't interested in drawing rooms and ballrooms. She wanted the laboratory. She found it on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, and when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. It was magnificent. The room was enormous, with windows that let in floods of northern light. Wooden tables lined the walls, covered with equipment she recognized from Dr. Hammond's lectures: microscopes, glass beakers, anatomical models, surgical instruments laid out with surgical precision. Shelves held jars of specimens suspended in alcohol, books on anatomy and physiology and chemistry, charts detailing the human body in exquisite detail. In the center of the room stood a proper dissection table. Eleanor moved through the space as though in a dream, touching things reverently: a microscope from Germany, a complete skeleton mounted on a stand, a set of surgical texts in Latin and French and German. "He meant it," she whispered to the empty room. "He actually meant it." She spent the entire day there, reading and examining and learning, losing herself in the pure joy of discovery. For the first time since her wedding, Eleanor felt something like happiness unfurl in her chest. She returned to her chambers only when darkness made reading impossible, and found another note. "I hope you found the laboratory satisfactory. Dinner is informal here. Join me if you wish, or take it in your rooms if you prefer solitude. S." Eleanor hesitated, then chose solitude. She wasn't ready yet to face her enigmatic husband over dinner, to make conversation when her head was full of anatomical structures and medical theories. This pattern continued for a week. Eleanor spent her days in the laboratory, her evenings in her chambers, and she saw the Duke only in passing, a glimpse of him riding across the grounds, a shadow disappearing into the West Wing, a figure in the library late at night when she came searching for a book and found him already there. He always nodded politely and left. On the 8th day, Dr. Hammond arrived. He was exactly as Eleanor remembered, a slight man in his 60s with fierce eyes and gentle hands, who'd risked his reputation to teach a woman in disguise because he believed knowledge should belong to anyone hungry enough to seek it. "Your Grace," he said when Eleanor met him in the entrance hall, and the title sounded absurd applied to her. "Please, Dr. Hammond, call me Eleanor, or Miss Hartwell if you must, but not Your Grace. You are a duchess now, my dear. Best to grow accustomed to it." But his eyes were kind. "Shall we begin?" They worked together for hours each day, and Eleanor felt like she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. Dr. Hammond taught her surgical techniques on cadavers he brought from London, procured through means Eleanor didn't ask about, and she learned to hold a scalpel without trembling, to see the body as a map to be read rather than a mystery to be feared. "You have genuine talent," Dr. Hammond told her one afternoon, watching her make a precise incision through muscle tissue. "In a different world, you would make an excellent surgeon." "In this world, I am a duchess who plays at medicine," Eleanor replied, but there was no bitterness in her voice. She'd made her choice. "Are you happy?" Dr. Hammond asked unexpectedly. Eleanor's hands stilled. "I have everything I wanted. A laboratory, books, education, freedom. What is happiness compared to that?" "Everything, my dear, everything." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She rose and wandered the castle's corridors, drawn by restlessness and curiosity in equal measure. She found herself in the West Wing without conscious decision, standing before a door that glowed with lamplight leaking around its edges. The Duke's laboratory, she realized, the place he'd told her not to ask about. Eleanor pressed her ear to the door and heard movement inside. The clink of glass, footsteps, and something else. A sound that might have been a cough or might have been a stifled cry of pain. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. This was not part of their arrangement. She'd promised not to ask questions. But as she turned to leave, the door opened. The Duke stood there in shirt sleeves, no jacket or cravat, looking more human than Eleanor had ever seen him, and more terrible. His face was gray with exhaustion, his eyes hollow, and there were stains on his shirt that looked disturbingly like blood. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a confession. "I thought I heard." He swayed slightly, catching himself against the doorframe. "Sebastian, are you injured?" Eleanor moved forward on instinct, her medical training overriding propriety. "No. Yes. Not in the way you mean." He drew a shuddering breath. "You should go back to your chambers. You look like you're about to collapse." "Frequently. I'm accustomed to it." Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She stepped past him into the laboratory, and what she saw there made her understanding of the world tilt sideways and rearrange itself into new patterns. The room was similar to her own laboratory, but darker, more desperate, and everywhere, on tables, in jars, in carefully labeled vials, was blood. "What is this?" Eleanor whispered. The Duke closed the door behind her with the air of a man accepting his execution. "This is why I needed a wife who wouldn't ask questions. Though I suppose I should have known that a woman who disguises herself to attend anatomy lectures wouldn't be capable of incurious compliance." "Sebastian, what are you doing in here?" He moved to one of the tables and picked up a vial of dark liquid. "Do you know what hemophilia is, Eleanor? A blood disorder. The blood doesn't clot properly. It's hereditary, passed through royal lines." Eleanor's mind raced ahead, connecting pieces. "You have it?" "No," the Duke said quietly. "I am dying of it. There's a difference." The words hung in the air between them like poison, or truth, or both. "How long have you known?" Eleanor asked. "Since I was a child. My father had it, and his father before him. We're descended from the Stuarts. They carried it in their blood like a curse. Most men with hemophilia die before 30. I'm 31. I am living on borrowed time, and I know it." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, understanding, terrible and complete. "That's why you wanted a marriage of convenience. Why you wanted a wife who wouldn't care if you died." "Yes." He set the vial down with careful precision. "I needed someone who would wear my title and protect my name, and ask nothing of me. Someone who would inherit my estates and, hopefully, continue my work. I'm trying to find a cure, Eleanor. Or if not a cure, then at least a treatment. Some way to help others like me." "Show me," Eleanor commanded. "What?" "Show me your research, your notes, everything." She moved closer, and the Duke backed away as though she carried a disease instead of him. "I'm not leaving this room until you do." For a long moment, they stared at each other, two strange people in a strange marriage, connected by secrets and blood and the desperate pursuit of impossible things. Then the Duke began to speak. He told her about years of research, of studying blood under microscopes, of corresponding with physicians across Europe, of testing theories on himself with the reckless desperation of a dying man. He showed her his notes, meticulous records of bleeding episodes, of clotting times, of failed experiments and small successes. "I thought, perhaps, if I could understand why my blood behaves differently, I could find a way to change it," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I've tried everything. Dietary changes, medicinal herbs, even transfusions from healthy donors. Nothing works. Nothing stops the bleeding once it starts." Eleanor studied his notes with the same intensity she brought to her anatomical studies. "You're approaching this wrong," she said finally. The Duke's laugh was bitter. "Of course I am. I'm a dying man playing at being a physician. No, you're brilliant, but you're focused on changing your blood when you should be focused on supplementing what it lacks." Eleanor began pulling books from his shelves, her mind racing. If the blood won't clot on its own, what if we could introduce something that would help it clot? Some substance that could be applied topically or perhaps even injected. That's been tried. It doesn't work. Not the way you're trying it. Eleanor spread her hands over his notes, over the maps of research and desperation. But what if we combined approaches? What if we took what Dr. Hammond has been teaching me about surgical techniques and applied it to your transfusion theories? What if we worked together? The Duke stared at her as though she'd suggested flying to the moon. "Why would you help me? This isn't part of our arrangement." "Our arrangement was a lie from the beginning," Eleanor said quietly. "You didn't want a wife who asked nothing of you. You wanted a wife who could understand what you're trying to do. You wanted a partner. I wanted you to be free," the Duke whispered, and Eleanor saw the truth of it in his eyes. He'd given her everything she needed because he knew he couldn't give her the one thing most marriages were built on, a future together. "Then give me the freedom to choose this," Eleanor said. "Let me help you. Let me try. And when I die anyway," his voice cracked on the words, "what then? Then we'll have tried together." "And you won't die alone in this laboratory, bleeding out while your wife lives in ignorance in the East Wing." Eleanor took his hand, carefully, because she understood now why he always held himself apart, why he feared human touch. "I don't need you to love me, Sebastian. I just need you to let me in." The Duke's control shattered. He sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands, and Eleanor saw his shoulders shake with exhaustion and relief and the terrible weight of no longer carrying his secret alone. She pulled up a chair beside him and began to read his research notes. And somewhere in the gray hours before dawn, they started to work. The household noticed the change immediately. The Duke and Duchess were seen together now, in the library, in her laboratory, hunched over books and experiments with the intensity of conspirators or lovers, or both. They took their meals together, though the servants reported that they barely seemed to notice the food, so absorbed were they in their discussions. Mrs. Blackwood reported to the staff that Her Grace had moved a writing desk into the Duke's laboratory, and that strange deliveries were arriving from London, medical equipment, chemicals, books in foreign languages. "They're an odd pair," the housekeeper said, but there was affection in her voice. But perhaps that's what the Duke needed, someone as strange as himself. Eleanor and Sebastian fell into a rhythm of collaboration that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. They worked through the nights, studying blood samples under microscopes, testing theories on tissues from Dr. Hammond's cadavers, arguing about methodology and approach with the passionate intensity of two people who cared about truth more than being right. "You're stubborn," Sebastian said one night, watching Eleanor rerun an experiment he'd declared a failure. "So are you," Eleanor replied without looking up. "That's why this might actually work." Dr. Hammond became a frequent visitor, and the three of them formed an unlikely alliance. The dying Duke, the disguised Duchess, and the doctor who believed knowledge was worth any risk. "You remind me why I became a physician," Dr. Hammond told them one evening, watching them work together with the precision of a surgical team. "Not for prestige or money, but for this, the pure pursuit of understanding, the hope of alleviating suffering." But understanding came slowly, and suffering came quickly. Eleanor learned to recognize the signs of a bleeding episode, the way Sebastian would grow quiet and still, the gray cast to his skin, the careful way he moved. She learned to help him manage them, to apply pressure and ice, to monitor him through the long hours of waiting to see if the bleeding would stop or continue until it killed him. "You should have married someone else," he told her once, lying on a sofa in his laboratory while Eleanor pressed clean linen to a wound on his arm that had been bleeding for 6 hours. "Someone who could give you a real marriage, children, a future." "I did marry someone who could give me those things," Eleanor said firmly. "You're not dead yet, Sebastian. Stop acting like you are. Practical as always. One of us has to be." But there were moments when practicality failed, when Eleanor found herself terrified by the fragility of the man she was learning to care for. Not the Duke, not the title, but Sebastian himself, brilliant and stubborn and secretly gentle, who remembered how she took her tea, who brought her books he thought she'd enjoy, who sometimes smiled at her theories with an expression that made her heart do complicated things. "I'm becoming attached to you," she confessed one night when exhaustion had stripped away her defenses. "That wasn't part of the arrangement." Sebastian looked up from his notes, and his expression was unreadable. "No," he agreed quietly, "it wasn't. Does it bother you?" "It terrifies me," he admitted. "Because I am becoming attached to you as well, and I have nothing to offer but grief." "You have yourself," Eleanor said. "That's enough. For now, perhaps. But Eleanor," he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm despite his pallor. "You must promise me something. When I die, you'll continue this work. You'll find the answer I couldn't find. You'll help others like me." "I'll promise nothing of the sort," Eleanor said sharply, "because you're not going to die. We're going to solve this together, and then you're going to live long enough to become a very annoying old man who criticizes my laboratory techniques." Sebastian laughed, and it was the first time Eleanor had heard genuine joy in his voice. Is that a threat or a promise? Both. But fate, Eleanor was learning, cared little for promises or threats. 3 months into their marriage, Sebastian suffered a bleeding episode that nearly killed him, a simple injury from a broken beaker that turned catastrophic. Eleanor and Dr. Hammond worked through the night to save him, applying every technique they knew, every theory they'd tested. At dawn, the bleeding finally stopped. Eleanor sat beside Sebastian's bed, watching him sleep with the grayish pallor of a man who'd lost too much blood, and she felt rage and fear and determination crystallize into something harder than diamond. "I'm going to save you," she whispered to his unconscious form. "I don't care what it takes. I don't care if it's impossible. I'm going to find the answer." Dr. Hammond found her there hours later, still keeping vigil. "You should rest, Eleanor." "I should work," Eleanor corrected. "There has to be something we're missing, some approach we haven't tried." "You can't save everyone, my dear. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, we lose people." "Not him," Eleanor said fiercely. "I won't lose him." The doctor studied her with eyes that had seen every iteration of human grief. "You love him." It wasn't a question. But Eleanor answered anyway, yes. I didn't mean to. It wasn't part of the arrangement. But yes, I love him. Does he know? No, and he can't know. He already believes he's a burden to me. If he knew I loved him, it would destroy him. Eleanor's voice broke on the words. So I'll save him, and I'll never tell him, and perhaps that will be enough. But Sebastian heard everything. He'd woken minutes before, and he lay still with his eyes closed, listening to Eleanor's confession, feeling each word like a knife or a kiss. He couldn't tell which. She loved him. His strange, brilliant wife loved him. And he, in turn, loved her with a desperation that made his carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. It changed nothing. It changed everything. When Eleanor finally left to rest, Sebastian opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of his chamber. He'd married her to set her free, to give her the tools she needed to pursue knowledge without binding her to a dying man's inevitable grief. Instead, he'd bound them together in ways far more profound than any legal document. He had to let her go. He had to push her away before his death destroyed her. Or he had to find a way to live. The choice should have been simple, but Sebastian had spent so long preparing to die that had forgotten how to fight for life. Now, for Eleanor's sake, he would have to remember. The season turned to summer, and with it came an invitation that changed the trajectory of their work. A medical symposium in Edinburgh, featuring presentations from the finest minds in European medicine. "We should go," Eleanor said, reading the announcement over breakfast. "There will be physicians there working on blood disorders, circulatory systems. Someone might have insights we're missing." Sebastian hesitated. "I don't do well with travel. The risk of injury." "Then we'll be extremely careful," Eleanor interrupted. "Sebastian, we can't do this alone. We need more knowledge, more perspectives. This could be our chance." Against his better judgment, Sebastian agreed. They set off for Scotland in a well-sprung carriage with enough medical supplies to stock a small hospital, Dr. Hammond accompanying them for safety. Edinburgh welcomed them with gray skies and colder winds, and the symposium was held in the ancient halls of the university's medical school. Eleanor had to attend as Sebastian's wife rather than as a scholar in her own right. Women weren't permitted to present or even sit in the main hall, but she and Sebastian had devised a solution. She would observe from the gallery reserved for wives and sisters, and Sebastian would present their joint research under his name alone. "It's not fair," Sebastian said as they prepared for his presentation. "This work is as much yours as mine." "The work is what matters," Eleanor replied, adjusting his cravat with wifely concern that masked scientific focus. "Not who receives credit. If our theories help even one person, that will be enough." The presentation was a sensation. Sebastian spoke with quiet authority about their research into blood clotting factors, about the possibility of supplementing deficient blood with elements that might help it clot. The gathered physicians peppered him with questions, some skeptical, some intrigued. But it was an older physician from Vienna who approached them afterward with information that would prove invaluable. "Your Grace, Duchess, Dr. Franz Müller," said, bowing to them both with the respect due their rank. "I was fascinated by your presentation. I have been working on similar problems, though from a different approach. Might we speak privately?" In Dr. Müller's rooms, he shared research that made Eleanor's pulse quicken, studies on blood factors in various animals, on substances that promoted clotting, on the possibility of isolating and concentrating these factors for medical use. "I have had some success with preparations from bovine blood," Dr. Franz Müller. Müller explained, showing them carefully preserved samples. "In animals, I have been able to reduce bleeding time significantly, but I have not yet tested it on human subjects." Sebastian and Eleanor exchanged glances, and an entire conversation happened in that single look. "I volunteer," Sebastian said. "Your Grace, I couldn't possibly," Dr. Mueller began. "I have hemophilia," Sebastian interrupted quietly. "I am dying of it. If your preparation has even a chance of helping, I will risk it." They worked through the night, Sebastian and Eleanor and Dr. Mueller preparing a treatment from the samples the Viennese doctor had brought. The science was sound, but untested. The risk enormous. "If this goes wrong," Sebastian told Eleanor as dawn broke over Edinburgh, "you must promise me you'll continue the work. Learn from my death if you cannot learn from my life." "If this goes wrong," Eleanor replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled as she prepared the injection, "I will spend the rest of my life perfecting it. But I believe it will work. I have to believe it." Dr. Hammond was there to monitor, Dr. Mueller to observe. Eleanor administered the injection herself, her hands finally steady when it mattered most. They made a small incision to test the results and watched in breathless silence as Sebastian's blood began to clot. Not immediately, not completely, but faster than it ever had before. "Again," Sebastian demanded. "Test it again." They repeated the experiment 3 times over the next week, each time with the same result: improved clotting time, reduced bleeding, hope crystallizing into something like proof. "We need more research," Dr. Mueller cautioned. "Repeated trials, refinement of the preparation, understanding of side effects and long-term efficacy." "Yes," Sebastian agreed, "but this is more than I've had in my entire life. This is possibility." On the journey home to Ashworth Castle, Sebastian and Eleanor sat together in the carriage, not speaking, but connected by something more profound than words. "I heard you," Sebastian said finally, as they crossed into England. "That night after the bleeding episode, I heard you tell Dr. Hammond that you loved me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Sebastian!" "Don't apologize," he interrupted gently. "Don't explain. I just need you to know that I heard you, and it changed everything." "How?" Eleanor whispered. "It made me want to live," Sebastian said simply. "Not just survive, not just endure, but actually live. Fight for life, hope for it. I'd given up hope long before I married you, Eleanor. You gave it back to me." "And you gave me freedom," Eleanor replied. "But I'm learning that freedom means nothing if you have no one to share it with." Sebastian took her hand, no longer carefully, no longer afraid of human touch, but with the confidence of a man who decided to claim his life instead of waiting for death to take it. "This arrangement of ours," he said, "the marriage of convenience, the separate lives, the absence of love, I'd like to renegotiate the terms." "Oh," Eleanor's heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I'd like to propose a new arrangement, one where we share a life instead of occupying separate wings, where we are partners in truth, not just in research, where I tell you every day that I love you, because I do, desperately, inconveniently, completely." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from grief, but from joy so overwhelming it had no other outlet. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he corrected gently, and kissed her for the first time, softly, carefully, with the tenderness of a man who'd learned that the most precious things are also the most fragile. "Sebastian," Eleanor agreed, and kissed him back with all the passion and certainty she'd been holding inside. They returned to Ashworth Castle transformed, not Duke and Duchess playing at marriage, but husband and wife in truth. Sebastian moved from the West Wing to Eleanor's rooms, and they scandalized the servants by continuing to work together in the laboratory even after they'd begun sharing a life. Dr. Hammond visited regularly, bringing news from Dr. Mueller and other physicians who'd heard about their breakthrough. The treatment was refined, tested, improved. Sebastian's bleeding episodes became less frequent, less severe. He was not cured. Hemophilia still lived in his blood like a shadow, but he was living, actually living. 6 months after their return from Edinburgh, Eleanor woke to find Sebastian already awake, watching her with an expression that made her heart ache with happiness. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man alive," he replied. "I married you to save you from disgrace, and you saved me from death instead." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "That's what partners do." A year after their wedding, Lady Hartwell visited Ashworth Castle and found her daughter transformed, confident, radiant, clearly beloved by her enigmatic husband. The laboratory was explained away as charitable medical research, and Lady Hartwell seemed content not to inquire further. "You look happy, Eleanor," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "Truly happy." "I am," Eleanor replied simply. "I have everything I ever wanted: knowledge, purpose, and love. They told me I couldn't have all three, but they were wrong." Caroline married well, and Margaret had a triumphant season. The Hartwell family's fortunes were restored, and Eleanor's early disgrace was forgotten in light of her successful match. But Eleanor cared little for society's approval anymore. She had Sebastian, she had her work, and she had a future that stretched before them full of possibility. They published their research under both their names, to hell with convention, and it changed the understanding of blood disorders forever. Other physicians built on their work, refined it further, saved lives that would have been lost. And in the laboratory at Ashworth Castle, the Duke and Duchess continued their research together, side by side, partners in science and life and love. On their second anniversary, Sebastian presented Eleanor with a gift, a brass plaque to mount on the laboratory door. It read, "The Hartwell Ashworth Laboratory of Hematological Research, founded by Eleanor and Sebastian, Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, in pursuit of knowledge and hope." "You wanted your name on the work," Sebastian explained, "so here it is, forever." Eleanor traced the letters of her name, not Lady Eleanor, not Her Grace, but simply Eleanor, scholar and partner and wife. "It's perfect," she whispered. "So are you," Sebastian replied, and kissed her in the laboratory where they'd found hope together, where they'd learned that the most profound discoveries aren't always about blood or science or medicine. Sometimes they're about two strange people finding each other in the darkness and deciding to bring light.